Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I'll group questions 27, 28 and 29 together. The UK has a long-standing tradition of securing human rights. Indeed, the United Kingdom, for many decades or indeed centuries, has been a beacon around the world for the protection of human rights. There is a review ongoing into the operation of the Human Rights Act, now over 20 years old. That review is being led by Sir Peter Gross, a retired Court of Appeal judge, supported by, amongst others, 2 QCs and 2 professors.
Let's go to Alan Dorrans. Alan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and good afternoon. The pandemic has seen necessary but drastic restrictions on human rights, including the right to assembly and protest, and there are fears that not all of these restrictions will be fully rolled back. Campaign Group Liberty have said the United Kingdom's government's police crime sentencing and courts bill will undermine protest, stifle dissent, and make it harder for us to hold the powerful to account. Does he agree that as the bill moves through Parliament, it should be guided by the principle that the right to peaceful assembly and protest as fundamental human rights must be protected at all costs?
Minister.
Also, I do agree that fundamental human rights should be protected at all costs. The bill that we're debating does protect the right to peaceful protest, while at the same time respecting the rights of other people to get to their work or for emergency vehicles to secure safe passage down a highway, for example. But I must say, on the question of human rights, I was concerned by the passage of the law through the Scottish Parliament last week, which had a chilling effect on free speech.
Let's go to Amy Callaghan. Amy.
Review of the Human Rights Act, in which it's made clear it would robustly oppose any attempt to undermine the UK's commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights or to distance the UK from membership of the Council of Europe. Does he agree it's crucial these assurances are given to Scotland, and will he be working to ensure the views of Scotland's government are heard and respected?
Minister.
Yes, most certainly. There is no plan to repudiate our obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights, and there's certainly no plan to leave the Council of Europe. So I can absolutely give the Honourable Lady the assurance she asks. And on the topic of working closely with the Scottish Government, yes, we are doing that. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Scottish Government for the response to the review's call to evidence, which I believe has already been received.
Let's go to Gavin Newlands. Gavin.
My friend has just referred to, in both this government's desire for power grabs in many other areas of Scottish Parliament competence and the fact that Scotland's legal system is separate and distinct, does he agree that when published, the review should include a commitment that it cannot and must not impinge on the integrity of Scots law?
Minister.
Well, the review is into human rights. As I said, the United Kingdom has been a beacon of human rights for many centuries now, and we intend to honour our ECHR obligations. There is no intention to interfere with the Scottish legal system, although I am rather concerned by the remarks Lord Hope said about the apparent problems with the independence of Scotland's prosecutors.
Let's go to Mary Kelly-Foy. Substantive question first from Minister Chop.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Prison safety and security is a key priority, and the Government is investing £100 million to introduce robust measures such as X-ray body scanners, phone blocking technology, as well as tools such as body-worn cameras and parva spray. On pay, in July 2020, the Government accepted in full 6 out of 7 recommendations made by the Prison Service Pay Review Body, delivering an increase in pay of at least 2.5% for all prison service staff, from those working on the gate through to those on the landings.
Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We heard at last month's Justice Questions that rejecting this expert advice will undermine prison safety and is in fact a false economy, because once tax returns and staff retention are taken into consideration, this pay rise practically pays for itself. So what's the real reason for denying prison officers pay justice? Is it because the Treasury is worried it'll encourage other public sector workers to demand a decent pay rise too?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her question. It's important to note that 6 out of the 7 recommendations were accepted in full. In terms of the freeze, that will not apply to those people who are earning under £24,000. But I'd also make this point, when it comes to safety, which was the central premise of her question, we've got to consider those conditions which make a difference to those valuable and professional officers on the landings. Do they feel safe? Do they have the body-worn camera? Do they have the SPEAR personal safety training? That's what we want to focus on so that they can get the protection they deserve.
We have a substantive question to Minister Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Deductions from benefit orders are only made by the court, and when the court makes them, the judge will take into account the affordability and the means of the person who is having the deduction order made. You can, of course, make an application later to remit part or all of the deduction if someone's personal circumstances have changed.
Let's go to Shabana Mahmood. Shabana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for that answer from the Minister, but he will know that the government has ordered job centre staff to apply the maximum 30% deduction from universal credit for claimants who have to pay a court fine, regardless of their circumstances. This approach is failing on 2 fronts. It pushes vulnerable claimants further into poverty, and it also recoups less money. The Ministry's own data shows that the amount of money recouped in respect of court fines fell by over 13% between June and August of last year, when the arbitrary 30% deduction was applied to all claimants. So will the Minister accept that this is the worst of all worlds and begin urgent discussions with his counterparts in the Department for Work and Pensions to follow the data and allow local decision makers a greater degree of discretion as to how much is deducted to pay a court fine from each individual claimant?
Well, I would just ask the House to be aware that not only do these deductions pay for fines, but they also pay for compensation to victims, and we should be mindful of that. I would also say that these orders are ultimately made by a judge, and the judge in making the order has discretion and will take into account someone's circumstances. And I would just repeat, Mr. Speaker, the point I made previously, that if someone is experiencing difficulty, it is always open to them to go back to the court in order to have the order remitted either in part or in whole.
We now come to Topical. Secretary Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The entire country has been shocked and appalled by the disappearance of Sarah Everard and the discovery of her body last week. And I know the thoughts of the whole House are with Sarah's family and friends. And our minds are also on our constituents, the women who have shared their own stories of harassment and harm over the last week. And after a quarter of a century working with victims as a criminal practitioner and sitting as a part-time judge, and as someone who's worked with members of all parties to successfully include stalking offences in our criminal law, and having taken groundbreaking legislation through this House on coercive control, these stories were all too depressingly familiar to me. Our country today should be a place where no woman has to live in fear of men. And I will continue to work tirelessly to build a criminal justice system that is better able to protect women and girls, and most notably via our landmark domestic abuse bill and the police crime sentencing and court bill that delivers more protection. The government will work across this House to achieve that end.
Let's go to Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank and echo the sentiments that the Justice Secretary has just expressed. But it was the Justice Secretary who made the required statutory statement that the police crime sentencing and courts bill is compatible with convention rights. But given the many voices expressing grave concerns about the impact of that bill on our human rights, especially rights relating to protest, did he have second thoughts about making that statement? And most importantly, will he listen to those concerns and act on them?
Secretary Butler.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, but no, I do not have any second thoughts. The particular provisions on protests are a reflection of the Law Commission's report of 2015, and indeed reflection of the common law in England and Wales on public nuisance, which refers to, amongst other things, annoyance, serious annoyance, and other terms which are well known to law. The maximum penalty in common law for public nuisance was life imprisonment. That's being reduced to 10 years. I really, frankly, do not see what the fuss is about. I rather think it is a confection designed to assist an opposition in difficulty.
Let's go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure myself and all the members of the Select Committee will also associate ourselves with the Secretary of State's comments. Does he agree that protection of the public it is served by deterrent sentencing when necessary, but also by a much broader and more nuanced suite of alternatives for those less serious offenders? And can he help us in particular as to the timescale for the rollout of problem-solving courts, which have been called for by the Select Committee and by many other commentators over a number of years, but which up until now has not always perhaps had the ministerial and governmental impetus behind it that is required to make it succeed as part of that smarter sentencing package?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, for raising the important issue of problem-solving courts. That's going to be an opportunity to bring together not just the court system, but also other agencies around the issue in order to deal with the particular challenge being faced by a family or indeed by somebody who's been accused of a criminal offence. The work on that is ongoing. I want to launch the pilots later this year, and of course that's very much at the heart of the sentencing white paper that I published last September. This is all about getting smart on sentencing and making sure that we reflect the reality of the challenges that are often faced by our courts.
Shadow Secretary David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, a study by the UN Women UK showed that 97% of young adult women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment in public places. 1 in 5 women will suffer sexual assault in their lifetimes. Under his watch, rape convictions have fallen to an all-time low at just 1.4%. What does the Lord Chancellor have to say to the 96% of abuse victims who feel it's no longer worth making a complaint? What does he have to say to the 45% who said complaining would make no difference? What does he have to say to all women who have suffered abuse and have given up hope of this government's ability to deliver them justice?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right to raise the worrying statistics about the gap that exists between the system and the confidence of women in particular who feel that the system does not work for them. I would remind him that this government has pioneered important legislation in areas like coercive control, stalking reform, and indeed changes in the domestic abuse bill that I know he and his party supports, and which have been further refined in their Lordship's House to include offences such as non-fatal strangulation, an extension to coercive control, and indeed threats to inflict revenge porn. We are able, in the bill that we are debating today, to go even further, to impose longer sentences for those who commit crimes predominantly against women and girls. He and his party have an opportunity tonight to help the very women that he talks about, but they choose to vote against, to not support the government in their fight against crime and in their support for victims such as women and girls.
He's got to watch it, Secretary of State, because I think he's getting annoyed, and he's made that something that you can go to prison for in the bill that we're voting on a bit later. 80% of women are in prison for non-violent offences, serving short sentences the government knows don't work. Most are themselves victims of crime, often much more serious crimes than they've been convicted of. Separated from their families, they lose their children, their jobs and their hope. Though they make up 5% of the prison population, they account for almost 20% of self-harm, which has gone up under his watch. While the Secretary of State works to save statues and gag protesters, more and more women become victims. When will he admit his government just doesn't care?
Secretary Buckland.
I think I'm entitled to be more than a little annoyed, Mr. Speaker, by the refusal of the opposition to come together to work to achieve a better society for women and girls. No, they've chosen the path of party politicking, and in an attempt to cover the deep divisions that exist on their side, they are politicising an issue that should rise above politics. I'm deeply disappointed, and yes, I am annoyed on behalf of the thousands of women and girls who see this as an opportunity for change. He's rejecting that. He's voting against tougher sentences. He'll have to answer to his constituents and the country.
Let's go to Laura Trott. Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nightingale courts have played a pivotal role in keeping our justice system going throughout the pandemic. Can I ask the Minister for an update for when a Nightingale court will be established in Kent? It will be vital to speeding up access to justice for my constituents and helping with those cases of highest risk of attrition, such as those of sexual violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the member for Sevenoaks has been a tireless and energetic advocate for a Nightingale Court in Kent, and the options are being studied very carefully by officials who will continue to work with her and her colleagues. We have got 49 courtrooms open for Nightingale Courts. That will shortly increase to 60. In relation to the terrible problem of domestic abuse and violence against women, which the Honourable Lady mentions, the Domestic Abuse Bill, of course, is going through Parliament. We'll be spending £140 million next year supporting women and victims. And we've been prioritising domestic violence protection orders throughout the pandemic. But I look forward to continuing our conversation about that Nightingale Court in Kent.
Spokesperson Anne McLaughlin. Anne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Cabinet Secretary or Minister welcome the announcement from the SNP government that whilst their government seems intent on rolling back human rights in the UK, Scotland will aim to strengthen them in a truly groundbreaking human rights bill? That bill will incorporate 4 UN treaties to further enhance the rights of women, people with disabilities, older people and minority ethnic communities. And would you agree that independence is the only way for the people of Scotland to truly safeguard their fundamental human rights?
If the answer to her question is separation, then it is entirely misconceived. The jurisdictions of England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland should be standing shoulder to shoulder in that fine tradition of the rule of law and respect for human rights. The Honourable Lady correctly refers to the Holyrood Parliament's decisions, and of course we respect that. But across the United Kingdom, we have world-leading, world-beating laws and provisions relating to the rights of vulnerable people that she talks about. The job is to make sure that that becomes more of a reality for more and more people, and that's what we should all be working together to achieve.
Let's go to Joy Morrissey. Joy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What progress has been made on the independent review of administrative law?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I will be making announcements on the independent review and the next steps very shortly. Judicial review plays a vital role in upholding the rule of law, and the reason we established the review was because we wanted to look carefully at whether it was running as it needs to or whether in fact changes will be needed. And I will make announcements to this House, Mr. Speaker, very shortly.
Let's go to Manera Wilson. Manera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. More than 230 people have now been prosecuted under the Coronavirus Act, but according to the CPS, every single one was incorrectly charged. Does the Secretary of State agree that this amount of confusion and mistakes brings the law into disrepute? And will he therefore accept that the Act should not be renewed in full this month, but instead look at the replacement Protect Everyone Bill proposed by Liberty and others?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that question. The primary responsibility for the superintendence of the CPS, of course, rests with my right honourable friend, the Attorney General. But she does make an important point about the reputation of the rule of law, and I know that these matters are being looked at very carefully indeed. I would commend the existing coronavirus legislation to her. It's been carefully sunsetted with review provisions, and I can assure her that ministers, including me, take that responsibility very seriously. Will not hesitate to remove provisions that either have not been used or which are just not proportionate to deal with the problems that we face.
Let's go to Durham Henry. Durham.
Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on victims, witnesses and defendants involved in court proceedings in the past year. And similar to the point made by my honourable friend, the member for Sevenoaks, the backlog of cases in Nottinghamshire currently stands at 1,200 cases in the Crown Court and 8,000 cases in the Magistrates' Court. To ensure the timely administration of justice, has my right honourable friend considered a Nightingale Court in Nottinghamshire so cases can be heard as quickly as possible? And if not, will he agree to meet with me and discuss what steps his department is taking to make sufficient inroads into the backlog of cases in Nottinghamshire?
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to let my honourable friend know that as a result of the campaigning that he and other Nottinghamshire colleagues have undertaken, we will indeed be opening a Nightingale Court in Nottingham before the end of this very month. And I agree that adding additional capacity through opening up Nightingales is the key to tackling the higher level of outstanding cases caused by the pandemic. We've now opened Nightingales in every HMCTS region, and we're on track to have a total of 60 additional courtrooms by the end of March.
Manjeet Singh Deshi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After the post-war recovery, legal aid was celebrated as being one of the great pillars of the welfare state, but thanks to a decade of Tory cuts, many of my Slough constituents and vulnerable people across our country no longer have access to justice. So what exactly is the Secretary of State doing to halt the terminal decline in the number of legal aid firms and solicitors?
Well, I greatly respect the honourable gentleman, and I'm more than happy to have a longer discussion with him in real time about the evolution of the legal aid system, which actually evolved under governments of both colours. And it's right to say that civil legal aid was slashed considerably by the Labour government in 1999. This government still spends £1.7 billion on legal aid. We are already dealing with criminal legal aid. We have a big review into that. And with regard to civil legal aid providers, I've already answered questions about the way we are seeking to procure more housing and debt advice. I can assure him that the challenges are great, but my personal commitment to legal aid, having been a practitioner in legal aid from my professional career, is real, sincere, and will yield proper results.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend knows, the Atlantic Hotel in Porthcawl and the Sunnyside Wellness Village in Bridgend are two of the 5 sites that have been shortlisted for a women's residential centre in South Wales. Can I thank my honourable and right honourable friends for the engagement I've had so far on this issue, where I've conveyed strong feelings of opposition to both of these sites? And will he now reiterate to the constituents of Bridgend and Porthcawl that he will consider the feelings of local residents and stakeholders before a decision is made? Thank you.
Well, my honourable friend is a doughty representative of his constituents. He rightly has consistently raised these issues with me on behalf of concerned local residents. The department has already written to residents living near the proposed locations and the options listed. We've advised them of the proposal and we're seeking their views. And we also want the views of Senedd members, local members of Parliament like my honourable friend, and indeed councillors before any final decision is made.
Final question. Speaker, when I introduced the emergency workers assault legislation in 2008 as a private member's bill, and when I had great support from the minister, I was always anxious that just passing the law would not be enough. We'd have to do lots of other things to make sure that we were really cracking down on assaults on emergency workers. One of the problems is that it's all very well doubling the sentence, as my bill does and as the government intends to do later on today, but magistrates' courts can only issue a sentence up to 6 months, so it has next to no effect unless the government implements Section 154 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003. When are they going to do that?
Well, the honourable gentleman, I need to say my honourable friend there, the honourable gentleman makes a very important point. I'm looking very carefully at those provisions. I think it's important to remember, of course, that the magistrates have the power to commit to sentence for the Crown Court when they consider their powers to be inadequate. I would urge that they do that with regard to particular... Well, I'm listening to him and I don't want to start to get into a debate with him, but I do think it's important that in guidance that is issued to legal advisers in the Magistrates' Court, that point is strongly made. I will look into that particular point to ensure that the maximum sentences that should be imposed consistent with the facts in a case are imposed to meet the justice that this House wanted to achieve for blue light emergency workers.
Order. I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes in order for the necessary arrangements to be made for the next business.
I now call the Prime Minister to make a statement. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will make a statement on the Government's integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, which we are publishing today. The overriding purpose of this review, the most comprehensive since the Cold War, is to make the United Kingdom stronger, safer and more prosperous, while standing up for our values. Our international policy is a vital instrument for fulfilling this Government's vision of uniting and levelling up across our country, reinforcing the Union and securing Britain's place as a science superpower and a hub of innovation and research. The review describes how we will bolster our alliances, strengthen our capabilities, find new ways of reaching solutions and relearn the art of competing against states with opposing values. We will be more dynamic abroad and more focused on delivering for our citizens at home. I begin with the essential fact that the fortunes of the British people are almost uniquely interlinked with events on the far side of the world. With the limited natural resources, we have always earned our living as a maritime trading nation. In 2019, the UK sold goods and services overseas worth £690 billion, fully a third of our GDP, sustaining millions of jobs and livelihoods everywhere from Stranraer to St Ives, and making our country the 5th biggest exporter in the world. Between 5 and 6 million Britons, nearly 1 in 10 of us, live permanently overseas, including 175,000 in the Gulf and nearly 2 million in Asia and Australasia. So a crisis in any of those regions, or in the trade routes connecting them, would be a crisis for us from the very beginning. The truth is that even if we wished it, and of course we don't, the UK could never turn inwards or be content with the cramped horizons of a regional foreign policy. For us, there are no faraway countries of which we know little. Global Britain is not a reflection of old obligations, still less a vainglorious gesture, but a necessity for the safety and prosperity of the British people in the decades ahead. And I'm determined that the UK will join our friends to ensure that free societies flourish after the pandemic, sharing the risks and burdens of addressing the world's toughest problems. The UK's presidency of the G7 has already produced agreement to explore a global treaty on pandemic preparedness, working through the WHO, the World Health Organization, to enshrine the steps that countries will need to take to prevent another COVID. We will host COP26 in Glasgow in November and rally as many nations as possible behind the target of net zero by 2050, leading by example, since the UK was the first major economy to accept this obligation in law. Britain will remain unswervingly committed to NATO and preserving peace and security in Europe. And from this secure basis, we will seek out friends and partners wherever they can be found, building a coalition for openness and innovation, and engaging more deeply in the Indo-Pacific. I have invited the leaders of Australia, South Korea and India to attend the G7 summit in Carbis Bay in June. And I'm delighted to announce that I will visit India next month to strengthen our friendship with the world's biggest democracy. Our approach will place diplomacy first, and the UK has applied to become a dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and we will seek to join the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. But all our international goals rest upon keeping our people safe at home and deterring those who would do us harm. So we will create a counter-terrorism operations centre, bringing together our ability to thwart the designs of terrorists, while also dealing with the actions of hostile states. And it is almost exactly 3 years since the Russian state used a chemical weapon in Salisbury, killing an innocent mother, Dawn Sturgis, and bringing fear to a tranquil city. I can announce that the National Cyber Force, which conducts offensive cyber operations against terrorists, hostile states and criminal gangs, will in future be located in a cyber corridor in the northwest of England. And we will also, well, close, Mr. Speaker, and we will also establish a cross-government situation centre in the Cabinet Office, learning the lessons of the pandemic and improving our use of data to anticipate and respond to future crises. The first outcome of the integrated review was the government's decision to invest an extra £24 billion in defence, allowing the wholesale modernisation of our armed forces and taking forward the renewal of our nuclear deterrent. The new money will be focused on mastering the emerging technologies that are transforming warfare, reflecting the premium placed on speed and deployment and technical skill. And my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, will set out the details next week. Later this year, HMS Queen Elizabeth will embark on her maiden deployment, leading a carrier strike group on a 20,000-mile voyage to the Indo-Pacific and back, exercising with Britain's allies and partners along the way and demonstrating the importance we attach to the freedom of the seas. By strengthening our armed forces, we will extend British influence while simultaneously creating jobs across the United Kingdom, reinforcing the Union and maximising our advantage in science and technology. This government will invest more in research and development than any of our predecessors, because innovation is the key to our success at home and abroad, from speeding our economic recovery to shaping emerging technologies in accordance with freedom and openness. We will better protect ourselves against threats to our economic security. Our newly independent trade policy will be an instrument for ensuring that the rules and standards in future trade agreements reflect our values. Our newly independent sanctions policy already allows the UK to act swiftly and robustly wherever necessary, and we were the first European country to sanction the generals in Myanmar after the coup last month. In all our endeavours, the United States will be our greatest ally and a uniquely close partner in defence, intelligence and security. Britain's commitment to the security of our European home will remain unconditional and immovable, incarnated by our leadership of NATO's deployment in Estonia. We shall stand up for our values as well as for our interests. And here I commend the vigilance and dedication of honourable members from all parties, because the UK, with the wholehearted support of this whole House, Mr. Speaker, has led the international community in expressing our deep concern over China's mass detention of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province, and in giving nearly 3 million of Hong Kong's people a route to British citizenship. There is no question that China will pose a great challenge for an open society such as ours. But we will also work with China where that is consistent with our values and interests, including building a stronger and positive economic relationship and in addressing climate change. The greater our unity at home, the stronger our influence abroad, which will in turn open up new markets and create jobs in every corner of the UK, not only maximising opportunities for the British people, but also, I hope, inspiring a sense of pride that their country is willing to follow in its finest traditions and stand up for what is right. With the extra investment and new capabilities of the integrated review, I believe the United Kingdom can thrive in an ever more competitive world and fulfil our historic mission as a force for the good. And I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. we want this integrated review to work. Threats to our national security are increasing, they're becoming more complex and less predictable. So the government has to get this right. But this review is built on foundations that have been weakened over the last decade. The Prime Minister has spoken of an era of retreat. He's right. In the last decade of Conservative government, defence spending and pay for the armed forces both fell in real terms. Our armed forces numbers have been cut by 45,000. And there's still a black hole of 17 million in the defence equipment plan. So whilst we do welcome the long overdue increase in capital funding, we do welcome the creation of a counter-terrorism operations centre and new investment in cyber, the Prime Minister can't avoid the question that everyone in our armed forces and their families will be asking today. Prime Minister, will there be further cuts to the strength of our army and our armed forces? The British Army is already 6,000 below the minimal level set out in the last review. It's been cut every year for the last decade. And it's being reported, Mr. Speaker, that the Army will see a further reduction of 10,000, alongside fewer tanks, fewer jets for the RAF and fewer frigates for the Royal Navy. Prime Minister, if those reports are untrue, can that be said today? Because, Mr. Speaker, successive Conservative Prime Ministers have cut the armed forces, but at least they've had the courage to come to this House and say so. This statement was silent on the issue. After everything the armed forces have done for us, the Prime Minister has a duty to be straight with them today. Mr. Speaker, turning to foreign policy, Britain needs to be a moral force for good in the world once again, leading the fight against climate change, strengthening multinational alliances, including NATO, championing human rights, valuing international development, and ensuring that trade deals protect high standards and public services. But there's a huge gap between that and the government's actions. The review rightly concludes that Russia remains the most acute threat to our security. That's not new, Mr. Speaker. 18 months ago, the Russia review concluded that the threat was urgent and immediate. So why have none of its recommendations been implemented? The integrated review talks about the importance of upholding international law. I agree. But from Europe to the Indian Ocean, this government now has a reputation for breaking international law, not defending it. We welcome the deepening of engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. But this comes on the back of an inconsistent policy towards China for a decade. Conservative governments have spent 10 years turning a blind eye to human rights abuses while inviting China to help build our infrastructure. Now that basic inconsistency is catching up with them. The review also talks of conflict resolution. Yet there's nothing about updating our arms export regime, in particular suspending sales arms to Saudi Arabia. The Prime Minister's statement, Mr. Speaker, didn't mention international development once. And I wonder why. Because he's cutting development spending for the first time in decades and denying this House a vote on it. If global Britain is to mean anything, it cannot mean selling arms to Saudi Arabia and cutting aid to Yemen. Mr. Speaker, I voted for the renewal of Trident, and the Labour Party's support for nuclear deterrence is non-negotiable. But this review breaks the goal. This review breaks the goal of successive Prime Ministers and cross-party efforts to reduce our nuclear stockpile. It doesn't explain when, why, or for what strategic purpose. So the Prime Minister needs to answer that question today. On trade, we recognise the need for new and ambitious trade deals. There needs to be a major boost in UK exports over the next decade. But that has to start with making a success of the Brexit deal And that won't happen unless we remove the new red tape that's now holding British businesses back. Mr. Speaker, Britain should and could be a moral force for good in the world. After a decade of neglect, this review was the chance to turn a corner. But there's now a very real risk that our armed forces will be stripped back even further, and that this review won't end the era of retreat. In fact, it'll extend it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, we have one of the toughest arms export regimes in the world under the consolidated guidance. Anybody listening to him would not realise, Mr. Speaker, we're the second biggest international donor of aid in the G7. And I think it's absolutely preposterous to hear the Labour leader calling for more investment in our armed forces, when this is the biggest investment in our armed forces since the Cold War. And when it wasn't so long ago, Mr. Speaker, £24 billion, wasn't so long ago, he was campaigning very hard, without dissent, to install a leader of the Labour Party as Prime Minister who wanted to withdraw from NATO and disband our armed forces. And the Right Honourable Lady heckles me from the front bench, Mr. Speaker, but it's ridiculous for him to talk about our nuclear defences, Mr. Speaker, when the reality is that Labour is all over the place. The shadow Foreign Secretary, the last time the House voted on our nuclear defences, protecting our nuclear defences, Mr. Speaker, the shadow Foreign Secretary voted against it, Mr. Speaker, and so did the current Labour Deputy Leader. And they want to talk about standing up for our armed forces, Mr. Speaker. Just in the last year, the Labour Party has been given the opportunity to back our armed services, our armed forces, our troops, our soldiers in the Overseas Operations Bill. They had the chance to stand up for veterans. They voted against it on a 3-line whip, Mr. Speaker. Those are the instincts of the Labour Party. Weak on supporting our troops, weak on backing Britain when it matters, and weak on defence.
Let's come to the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I think my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has pointed out that the present Labour leadership is more on the side of Ernest Bevin, who is against fascism and against left wing both at home and abroad. I think that's a sign of some kind of unity. The Prime Minister didn't mention development much in his statement, and I'd ask whether he would meet us to have a discussion on it. The question of meeting the 0.7%, 70 pence every £100 of our income, has been agreed. The government said it will be maintained. They now say there's going to be a gap and it will be restored. We want that gap to be evaporated, to go away, not to happen. The aid goes down with our income, it should go up with our income, and we should meet the commitment we've made in successive manifestos. I'll leave it to the Prime Minister to say when it is that those who are concerned for aid for Yemen and for VSO and others will actually get the answer to whether they're going to be cut as well. I want to stand beside the Prime Minister as well as behind him, and we ought to meet the commitment that he wrote in our 2019 manifesto of proudly meeting that commitment.
Minister.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and I think people listening to this debate might not grasp that actually this country is the biggest European donor to Yemen, and given £1 billion over the last 6 years, 87 million this year, and I don't think they grasp that actually we're giving £10 billion in international aid. And I think we can be very proud of what we're doing. And of course we will return to the 0.7 target when fiscal circumstances allow.
Right, let us go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. And let me also begin by thanking my SNP colleagues, led by the members for Glasgow South and Stirling, who compiled a very substantial and constructive submission on behalf of the SNP during the review's consultation. Mr. Speaker, today's statement is one more insight into just how hollow the brand of global Britain actually is. Because the Prime Minister's rhetoric always fails to come close to reality. Today, the Prime Minister preaches about international obligation, when only yesterday our closest partners in the EU are bringing his government to court for breaking international law. The Prime Minister talks about partnership with nations across the world in the very week that the most senior figures in the US, including the Speaker of Congress, warned against the UK's increasingly unilateralist approach. The chasm between the Prime Minister's rhetoric and the reality of his government's actions is deeply damaging. Just because he wastes £2.6 million desperately trying to copy the White House's press briefing room doesn't hide the reality of the UK's weakening global influence. So, Mr. Speaker, given our limited time, let me ask a number of specific questions that we demand answers to. On cuts to army personnel, Mr. Speaker, we were promised that 12,500 personnel would be stationed permanently in Scotland. The current number remains well below 10,000, and not only that, it is expected that cuts of 10,000 to the army overall will take place. So will the Prime Minister be prepared to admit that this is one more broken Tory promise to our armed forces and to the people of Scotland? On international aid cuts, this review fails to immediately reinstate our moral obligation and his party's manifesto commitment to spend 0.7% on aid and development. Under this plan, countries devastated by war and famine, Yemen, Syria, and South Sudan, will have their humanitarian aid slashed. And only this morning, it is emerging that this UK government also plans to cut its human rights support and anti-corruption measures by a staggering 80%. If the Prime Minister is prepared to stand over these callous cuts, is he also prepared to guarantee that he will put a straight vote on this in the House of Commons? And finally, on Trident nuclear weapons, this review disgracefully endorses the attainment of 80 more of these weapons of mass destruction. Can the Prime Minister tell us who gave his government the democratic right to renege on the UK's obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this government continues to invest massively in projects that will bring benefit to the whole of the UK, including to Scotland, and I can tell him that there'll be further investments in Lossiemouth, that there is no threat, for instance, to the Black Watch, which I know that he and his colleagues sometimes like to raise in order to alarm people. We will continue to invest massively in overseas development aid, which he rightly mentions, and we're very proud of what we're doing. And by the way, that delivers 500 jobs in East Kilbride. We'll continue to invest in shipbuilding, which drives jobs across the whole of the UK and particularly in Scotland. And I think it's a fantastic thing to see those ships being built by apprentices in Govan, as he has, as I'm sure. The only thing that endangers those investments and working together as one UK, working with all the fantastic people in the armed services in Scotland, is the reckless referendum, which I think his party insists on calling in the most inapposite time possible for this country.
We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Hilton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the comprehensive ambitions set out in this important integrated review paper today. There is a 1930s feel to the scale of challenges that we face today, with rising authoritarian powers, weak global institutions, and an absence of Western leadership and collective resolve. I was hoping for a Fulton, Missouri moment, Mr. Speaker, when we finally call out China for the geostrategic threat that it is, and a commitment to our aid budget. But I do hope the Prime Minister will summon that Atlantic Charter spirit of working together with our closest ally, the United States, to strengthen the rules-based order, such as advancing the G7 to the G10, which could form the backbone to revising trade and security standards that our ever-dangerous world so desperately needs.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and I must say that I think that there is a balance to be struck, because after all, we have a strong trading relationship with China worth about £81 billion. China is the second largest economy in the world and a fact of our lives, and I think we must accept that fact in a clear-eyed way. But we've also got to be tough where we see risk. And that's why this government has brought in the National Security and Investment Bill to protect our intellectual property. That's why we're protecting our critical national infrastructure. That's why my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has done more than I think virtually any other Foreign Secretary around the world to call out what China is doing in Xinjiang. And that's why this government has offered a place, a refuge and abode to 3 million Hong Kong Chinese who may be in fear of persecution as a result of what is happening in Hong Kong. This government takes a very, very clear-eyed approach to what is happening in China. It is a balanced approach and one that I think the British people understand.
Show the PSC, mate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot of words like ambition and innovation. So let me bring the Prime Minister a little bit back down to earth and sea. We have an aircraft carrier strike group with not enough aircraft and not enough ships to support it. We have rotting nuclear submarines, not a single one that has been decommissioned. We have a living accommodation for single personnel and families that is woefully inadequate and needing investment. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, the maths doesn't add up. The gap in what's needed to just deliver what's in plan now is huge, even with the additional investment. So perhaps the Prime Minister could level with the House, the country and our armed forces and tell us now what's going to be cut so that this can be afforded.
Prime Minister.
I thank her, but she should recognise that this is the biggest commitment in spending on our armed forces since the end of the Cold War. Labour left a black hole in our defence money of 38 billion. 38 billion. Yes, they did. Yes, they did, Mr. Speaker. This is a massive investment, and it is designed to deal with the chronic problems that previous governments have failed to address. Modernising our forces with AI, with the Future Combat Air System, and finally moving into cyber. I think that is the investment, the hard-edged investment this country needs to modernise our forces and take them forward. Labour consistently failed to do that.
Let's come to Dr. Julian Lewis.
As the Prime Minister just mentioned the National Security and Investment Bill, I hope I can rely on him to help the Intelligence and Security Committee remove the obstacles that are being placed in our way in wishing to scrutinise the work of its Investment Security Unit. Now, though there are strong analytical aspects to this review, it's suggested on pages 62 to 3 that our adversary, Communist China, quotes, is an increasingly important partner in tackling global challenges like pandemic preparedness, if you please, and that we want deeper trade links and more Chinese investment in the UK. Doesn't that unfortunately demonstrate that the grasping naivety of the Cameron-Osborne years still lingers on in some departments of state?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for those who call for a new Cold War on China, or for us to sequester our economy entirely from China, which seems to be the new policy of the opposition, weaving as they generally do from one position to the next, are I think mistaken. We have a balance to strike, and we needed to have a clear-eyed relationship with China. Of course, we're protecting our critical national infrastructure, and we'll continue to do that, and we will make sure that through the Security and Investments Bill, we protect our national, we protect our intellectual property. And we will take tough measures, as I have said, to call out China for what they're doing in Xinjiang. And there is no one around the world who has done more on that matter than my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, or this government. We will continue to do that. Companies that profit from trade in forced labour will not be allowed to do so in this country. And I think the whole House should be very proud of what we're doing.
Let's go to Sarah Champion. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really shocked that development is barely mentioned in the integrated review. When will the Prime Minister understand that full tummies, economic opportunity and stable governments create the stronger, safer and more prosperous world that he wants, not more nuclear weapons? When we look at the cuts that we know of so far, cuts to the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund, 80% cuts in aid corruption work, how does this make sense to create this stable world? When does the government plan to publish its development strategy? Will it actually consult with the NGOs, the Global South, and indeed Parliament and the IDC on this review? Please tell us, we need to know the details.
Mr. Speaker, as I've just explained, the development remains an absolutely critical part of the UK's foreign and overseas policy, and £10 billion is being spent this year. And given what this country has been going through, given that we've been obliged to spend £280 billion to prop up jobs and livelihoods, another £63 billion to support the NHS, £37 billion on supporting local councils, I think it's up to members opposite to say which of that support for the NHS they would cut, what they would reduce to spend more on overseas aid. Of course we want the percentage to go back up again when fiscal circumstances allow. But I think people of common sense understand that £10 billion is a huge sum in the current circumstances, and they will appreciate that it is right to wait until fiscal circumstances have improved.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the integrated review as it's set out, and I welcome its aspiration to coherence. I also welcome the fact that many of the ideas, not just the author, have been stolen from the Foreign Affairs Committee, and on that I am very grateful. But may I ask that some of the aspects that we have touched on in the past few years are addressed in the strategies that have not been clarified in today's paper, strategies on artificial intelligence and indeed on different forms of financial threats. Because where we need to see the UK standing up for ourselves is not just in aid and sticking to the 0.7, which the Prime Minister has already touched on, but also in platforms, making sure that we don't just reallocate aid to defence, but we actually increase the number of ships so that our presence in the East is real and not digital. We also need to look hard at the new threats, from cryptocurrency to the financial misdealings in the City of London that threaten our national security so obviously, whether that's dirty Russian money or increasingly dirty Chinese money. We need to stand up for Britain's interests and bring these tools together. This is a very, very welcome start, but will he please put some meat on those bones and make sure that when we hear the command paper next week, we don't find that this is a snowstorm without the pounds attached.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pretty big blizzard of a snowstorm when you consider it's £24 billion and the biggest investment since the Cold War, and we cover every aspect of the subjects that he's just raised, from artificial intelligence to the threat of cryptocurrencies, and it remains the case that the UK, under these proposals, will continue to be able to project, one of the few countries in the world to be able to project force 8,000 miles, thanks to our carrier strike force, and we are making the investments now. We are making the investments now that are grasping the nettle that previous governments have failed to grasp for decades.
Let's go to Leila Moran. Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reneging on the commitment to retain 0.7% of GNI on development spending is a short-sighted mistake. And the Prime Minister's promise that it will be just temporary isn't good enough. After all, he said he wouldn't cut it in his own party's manifesto. Weasel words on aid won't wash. Now, the Prime Minister has said a number of times in this statement so far that aid spending will be restored, and I quote, when fiscal circumstances allow. But we all know that the fallout from this pandemic is going to last years, if not decades. So will the Prime Minister promise this House today that this unlawful development cut will be for 1 year? And if it might be for longer, then why doesn't he just come and seek a vote on it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the habit of reading out questions that have been prepared means that I'm obliged to return to the Honourable Lady to the answer I gave just a little while ago. We will, of course, return to the 0.7 when fiscal circumstances allow, but I think in the meantime, most people in this country will be amazed, proud and pleased that in spite of the difficulties we face, we're spending £10 billion on the poorest and neediest around the world.
Andrew Mitch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is much to be welcomed in my right honourable friend's statement today. But is he not concerned that our position as chair of the G7 is undermined by Britain being the only country in the G7 that is cutting its development budget in breach of our clear party manifesto commitment? And if he is determined to pursue this aspect of his policy, I know my right honourable friend. He is a Democrat. When will he bring it to the House for a vote? Otherwise, he may be in danger, as from the start of the new financial year, of creating an unlawful budget.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have great respect and admiration for my right honourable friend who's campaigned for many years on international development and done much good. But I have to say that listening to contributions from around the chamber today, I think we're in danger of talking Britain down, Mr. Speaker, because the investments that we are making are colossal. Absolutely colossal by international standards, by any international standards. We're the second biggest contributor in aid in the G7 already, and we're contributing, in spite of all the difficulties occasioned by this pandemic, we are contributing £10 billion this year to support the poorest and neediest in the world. And yes, I can reassure my right honourable friend that we will return to the 0.7 when the fiscal circumstances allow. But the law makes it very clear that when we have exceptional circumstances, and I don't think anybody in this House or around the world would contest that we've had exceptional circumstances, Mr. Speaker, we are entitled to vary that 0.7 commitment, and that is what we're doing.
Let's go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given he said the climate crisis is his #1 international priority, it's disappointing that there's a climate-shaped hole at the heart of the Prime Minister's review, with resources dangerously diverted to nuclear weapons. Earlier today, the Foreign Secretary justified breaking our nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations on the grounds that nuclear weapons are, and I quote, the ultimate insurance policy against the worst threat from hostile states. Well, the logical consequence of that position is surely that every country should be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons on the same insurance policy grounds. So if such nuclear proliferation happens, and since we're increasing our nuclear warheads by more than 40%, how could we possibly have any moral authority to speak out against it? If that nuclear proliferation happens, does the Prime Minister think the world as a whole would be more safe or less safe?
Prime Minister.
It's entertaining, Mr. Speaker, to see the Shadow Foreign Secretary nodding along to her denunciation of nuclear weapons after what we heard from the Labour leader. Quite extraordinary, Mr. Speaker. But I really don't think that the Right Honourable Lady can have been reading the integrated review at all, because it sets out very clearly that we're going to be investing £11.6 billion internationally on tackling climate change, and it develops the 10-point plan that the UK is advancing for tackling the emission of greenhouse gases, and it stresses that this is the first country in the first major Western economy to go for a net zero target by 2050. I think she should be applauding this document, but I have to assume that she hasn't yet properly read it.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome this integrated review, though I think there will be challenges in re-engineering Whitehall for this common purpose. How does my right honourable friend assess the threat from Iran to the Gulf region and the UK's strategic interests? And what does he believe are the opportunities for increased peace and prosperity as a result of the signing of the Abraham Accords between Israel, the UAE and Bahrain?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend who knows whereof he speaks and has done much to advance the cause of peace in the Middle East. And I must say I think that it was an unexpected breakthrough for many in the foreign policy establishment to see the Abraham Accords, and I think a significant and positive step forward. As for Iran, I must tell him that what I'm sure he knows, that we remain extremely concerned by Iran's influence in the region, the disruptive behaviour of Iran, and particularly, of course, we are concerned by the risk of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, a viable nuclear weapon, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we think it right that Iran should be in compliance with the JCPOA, not just for the benefit of the region, but for the benefit and security of the people of Iran.
Let's go to Hull, William. Hull.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This integrated review looks like a desperate, confused and self-important search for purpose, far, far removed from the concerns of the people of Wales. With Welsh trade with our most important trading partner, the EU, collapsing as a result of the fundamental political and strategic error of our exit, is it not increasingly clear that the best interests of my country would be served not by squandering billions and more literally useless nuclear weapons, but rather by our ability to pursue our own course in the world?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I just remind the honourable gentleman that Wales voted to leave the EU, and I think that they did the right thing for all sorts of reasons, and it is, I'm afraid, not that I think he supports it, but the Welsh Labour government that continues to squander money hand over fist on all sorts of projects that I don't believe are in the interests of the people of Wales. £144 million on a study for a tunnel alone, or for a bypass, I should say.
Let's go to Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this integrated review, recognise how difficult it is to do one during a pandemic. I am worried about designating China simply as a systemic challenge, given the terrible events in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So will he keep this under review? Does he also agree that because the 0.7% cut is strictly temporary relating to the pandemic, there's no need to amend legislation? And finally, isn't one of the most important reasons to build up Britain's might to stand squarely behind individual British citizens in peril, like Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, so there are no more victims of Iran's vile hostage diplomacy?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. He's right in what he says about the ODA commitment. He's right in what he says about China, and of course we'll keep that under review. As I've said, I think that a balance has got to be struck. And yes, he's right that the UK government should stick up for British citizens, and I thank him for everything he did in his tenure as Foreign Secretary to secure the release of Nazanin and Zaghari Ratcliffe. I think it remains a disgrace that she is in effective captivity in Tehran, and I raised the very matter on March the 10th with President Rouhani myself.
Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? Can the Prime Minister outline the strategy to bring recruitment of foot soldiers back into line post-COVID, as well as recruitment for the cyber soldiers? And can I highlight that the Centre for Cyber Security in Europe is Belfast in Northern Ireland, with trained staff, low rates, and would the Prime Minister also consider basing security in Northern Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the first point to make about the armed forces is there will be no redundancies under this plan. There will be massive investment in our land forces, and particularly in cyber forces. And we are taking the tough decisions needed to modernise and improve our armed forces. And yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's expensive. It requires £24 billion to do it, but it means taking historic and difficult decisions now, and that's what we're doing.
We now go to Jack Lepresti. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As someone who is very proud to represent a constituency with tens of thousands of defence and aerospace jobs, I am delighted that at the heart of this review is investment in domestic industries. Now, does the Prime Minister think that increasing our sovereign defence manufacturing capability will assist us strategically in projecting power and sustaining operations across the globe?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and this is one of the things that our defence investments can do, that helps entrench our union and builds jobs and growth across the whole of the United Kingdom. And there is a steady stream now of shipbuilding contracts and many other defence contracts that will drive high-quality jobs for a generation to come.
Let's go to Dame Diana Johnson. Dame Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In building national resilience, can the Prime Minister explain how that will include the digital transformation of the security and intelligence agencies, where the resources will come from, and whether it will include industry and international partners?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I just said to the honourable gentleman, we are investing massively in cyber and in upgrading the cyber skills of our troops.
Let's go to Robert Halfon. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The late and respected American Senator John McCain said in 2008 in a speech We have to strengthen our global alliances as the core of a new global compact, a league of democracies that can harness the vast influence of the more than 100 democratic nations around the world to advance our values and defend our shared interests. Can my right honourable friends' welcome vision set out today be aligned with those smaller nations around the world, especially like Kurdistan in northern Iraq and Israel, who are vanguards of religious pluralism, democracy, free society, the rule of law, and security against terrorism, and for Great Britain to lead a new alliance of democracies around the world, as proposed by the late Senator John McCain?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, our commitment to Israeli security is unwavering, and we continue to work closely with our partners in the Kurdish region of Iraq.
We now go to Dick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister level with the country and tell us exactly how he plans to reduce the armed forces by 10,000 in the years ahead?
Mr. Speaker, I've already explained that this is the biggest investment in our armed forces since the Cold War, and there will be no redundancies across the armed forces.
Let's go to Jane Stevenson. Jane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been absolutely honoured this year to spend time with the Royal Navy as part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. In a world where new powers are using new tools to redefine the international order, does my right honourable friend agree it's vital that we now invest in new technologies such as cyber so that our fantastic armed forces personnel are fully equipped to face 21st century challenges to our nation's defence?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're investing in cyber and in shipbuilding. And we will have, by the end of this decade, 24 frigates, as opposed to the 15 today.
The Prime Minister says that he is tough on illegal migration at home, but by withdrawing and reducing aid and development and military support in areas of conflict, famine and war and instability, it will be a driver of a new wave of international migration. Does he not accept that you cannot be tough and claim to be tough on illegal migration at home if your policies are driving it to start with?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is not right. In fact, I think he's talking total nonsense. The most effective thing we can do to ensure that we protect ourselves against illegal migration is to do what we have done, which is take back control of our borders, a measure that he opposed and his party would repudiate.
Let's go to Sir David Avenant. Sir David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly welcome and support my right honourable friend's statement today on our post-Brexit strategy set out in the integrated review. Would he agree that global Britain needs to maximise and coordinate our opportunities to promote and protect British industry and interests across the world, including those of our overseas territories?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's quite right, because this integrated review supports our overseas territories and our crown dependencies, and our armed forces will continue to deter challenges to Gibraltar. We will maintain a permanent presence on the Falkland Islands, Ascension Island, and British Indian Ocean territories, and we will use our increased maritime presence around the world to protect the very territories and dependencies that he mentions.
Let's go to Martin Day. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we heard the PM speak about a premium based on speed, but Scotland's waters make up over 60% of UK waters, while the Royal Navy's most northern surface warship base is on the UK's southern coast. Can the Prime Minister confirm that this review means that despite regular territorial incursions from Russia's Navy and Air Force, Scotland still hosts no major surface warships, a fact that means scrambling the fleet-ready escort to Scottish waters takes 24 hours. How on earth is that a premium based on speed?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm interested to hear his emphatic desire as a Scottish nationalist, SNP, for a UK defence role. I think he's absolutely right, but I can tell him that the salient point is that all our nuclear deterrent is now based on the Clyde, and that is all our submarines, I should say, are based on the Clyde.
Let's go to Crispin Blunt. Crispin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I strongly welcome the much greater coherence that this review will deliver to our national security strategy, both for our nation's immediate defence, but so that all its elements are working together towards an open international order and being a force for good in the world, supporting open societies, human rights and good governance. And as part of this, can I continue to assume that we will honour our commitment to be the country that leads the world in helping hundreds of millions of LGBT people to have the freedom to be themselves, with all the benefits that come from that for the prosperity of those states and the wealth of the spirit for the individuals involved?
Prime Minister.
Yes, thank you. I thank my brother friend. He's totally right. And this is one of the areas that I know that every embassy, every consulate in the Foreign Office campaigns on. And I believe we make a huge difference around the world. There are countries that have changed their policies on marriage, on their approach to LGBT issues in response to British lobbying, and the latest Magnitsky sanctions that we have implemented, Mr. Speaker, are in respect of Chechnya for their policy on LGBT issues. And we will continue to campaign and to evangelise for our values and for our beliefs around the world.
Let's go to Christine Jardine. Christine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I draw the House's attention to the fact that I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and in that capacity, I'm aware of the importance of the work that it and other organisations do in protecting open democratic societies across the globe. Not being a Scottish nationalist, I am also aware of how important that is to the UK's own national interests. So can the Prime Minister assure us that that work will continue despite the difficulties we face following the current financial year?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can. And I've seen the excellent work that the Westminster Foundation for Democracy does around the world. I've personally attended debates that the Westminster Foundation is championing in countries where democracy is precarious, and I thank the Honourable Lady very much for what she's doing.
Let's go to Joe Gideon. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our international ambitions must start at home, and through the integrated review, we will drive investment back into our communities. It is essential that we ensure the UK is on the cutting edge of innovation and create an entire country that is match fit for a more competitive world. In my constituency of Stoke-on-Trent Central, advanced ceramics from local firm Lucidian recently landed on Mars. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the sky is not the limit when it comes to innovation?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm thrilled and amazed to hear that ceramics from my honourable friend's constituency have landed on Mars, and that is not the limit of our ambitions, as she knows, Mr. Speaker, because the Space Council has recently approved all sorts of missions and ambitions for the UK. But the point of what we're doing is not just to push back the frontiers of science and knowledge across the universe, Mr. Speaker, but to drive jobs and growth in her constituency and around the whole UK. And that is the point of the Global Britain agenda, because we believe that by exerting British influence in the world in the way that we are, we can drive the UK economy and drive prosperity here at home.
Let's go to Darren Jones. Darren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I declare my interest as set out on the register. I welcome the recognition in the integrated review of threats to our democracy and the role that technology, disinformation and other forms of hybrid warfare play in that threat. On that basis, can the Prime Minister confirm that the online safety bill, later being presented to the House this year, will contain sufficient powers to tackle collective online harms, including threats to our democracy?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can.
Let's go to Marco Longi. Marco.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The integrated review is clearly extremely welcome. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that a vigorous approach to foreign policy that recognises the importance of the Indo-Pacific region is key, and that a truly global Britain that forges strategic ties with future superpowers, such as Brazil, who partner with us in the development of the Oxford vaccine, is also of crucial importance?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, I know that I speak for my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and indeed for my right honourable friend himself when I say we understand the importance of Brazil. I share his analysis about the future of Brazil, and together with the Canning of our times, the Foreign Secretary, we intend to build closer relationships, not just with Mercosur, Brazil and the rest of the Mercosur countries, but also with the Pacific Alliance countries as well.
Let's go to Margaret Farrier. Margaret Farrier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With hostile states, non-state actors, terror and crime groups all posing a threat to the UK and our allies, it is important to be prepared, adapt and develop our cyber technology and capabilities. However, Prime Minister, increasing our nuclear weapons arsenal is something I can't condone. Both President Biden and Putin renewed their bilateral nuclear weapons reductions New START treaty just last month. So why is the Prime Minister going against the flow by increasing our arsenal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course we're committed to nuclear arms reduction, and indeed we believe that China should be brought into strategic nuclear arms reduction. But one of the most important things about having a credible deterrent for friend and foe alike is that you set out what you have, and that's what this integrated review does.
Let's go to Catherine Fletcher. Catherine.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the PM for an important statement about the future security of our proud nation, addressing both the challenges and opportunities the UK faces in a more competitive world is needed, especially when those that seek to harm us are using all of the tools of modern technology at their disposal. Now, Lancashire has a proud history of engineering technology solutions. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that in the future, more investment in our technologies, such as cyber, will be key to our defence? And will he take account of Lancashire's skills and ability to deliver?
I know that she was listening very carefully to the statement, and she will have spotted that there is a commitment to the Northwest, to cyber in Lancashire, well, Mr. Speaker, I've heard your representations, Mr. Speaker. You'll have to wait for the Defence Secretary to explain exactly where it's going to be. But to boost those skills and to boost those jobs for the long term, to make that transformation in defence technology, in which Lancashire is undoubtedly going to lead, we're investing £6.6 billion in defence R&D over the next 4 years.
We'll certainly take Lancashire if we don't say whereabouts. Emma Lewellberg. Emma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The review and the Prime Minister's statement are typically big on words but scant on detail or strategy, and massive contradictions steeped in a lack of realism when it comes to affordability and scope, as well as zero acknowledgement of the harm years of underinvestment in our nation's defence have caused. Ultimately, the world will judge him and his government on their actions. So can he explain how breaching Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty fits with his commitment to international law?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, I never saw such a seething mass of contradictions as the opposition front bench, because you only have to go a few yards from the leader of the opposition to the shadow foreign secretary to find a complete gulf in their view on the very matter she raises. He claims to be in favour of the nuclear deterrent. She voted against it, Mr. Speaker. The most consistent thing that our friends and allies, as well as our foes around the world, need to know is the UK is committed to the defence of this country and committed to our nuclear defence.
We've got to make sure when we do say how people voted, we are correct. Pauline Latham. Pauline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There's much to commend in this statement from the Prime Minister, but I am very saddened to hear that we're going to be balancing the books on the backs of the poor. We are devastating the amount of money that's going to Yemen, to Sudan, just to mention two countries where children and mothers and families, whole families, are devastated by what they're having to face. We're also aware that funding is being decided, but VSO at the moment do not know when the funding is coming. And if they don't have funding by the end of this month, they are going to have to end its COVID-19 response programme in 18 countries, leaving 4.5 million people without support. This decision obviously can't easily be reversed. So will the Prime Minister let us know whether the VSO will have some money to continue, or if not, when that funding decision will be taken?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've much enjoyed over the years working with my honourable friend, and I understand what she says about Yemen. I just wish to repeat that I think that most people in this country will be reassured to know that the government, UK, continues to be one of the biggest providers for the people of Yemen, the biggest in Europe. And looking at VSO, which I also strongly support, and some of my family have done it. My honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, will be setting out the position shortly.
Let's go to Dan Jarvis. Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite 20 years of bloodshed, the integrated review only pays 2 glancing references to Afghanistan. Given more than 150,000 people, including 457 British servicemen and women, have lost their lives in this conflict, can the Prime Minister say how the UK will help establish a lasting peace in the region?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, as I've repeatedly told President Ghani of Afghanistan, our commitment is for the long term. He knows the difficulties that in the current situation, the decisions that the US government has to take. The UK is working very hard to ensure that there is a viable process, and that we do not see a return to the kind of civil war that has, I'm afraid, bedeviled Afghanistan. I believe that the legacy of this government and of this country in Afghanistan, and the commitment of British troops, the loss of life that he rightly calls attention to, is a proud one, and we must make sure that it is not betrayed, and that we leave a legacy in the education of women, in the security of the people of Afghanistan that is lasting and that endures.
James Sunderland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a former soldier, could I please reassure the Prime Minister that taking the review back to first principles and assessing future capability requirements against the threat is absolutely the right thing to do. But could I also ask him to reassure me that where restructuring is needed, notably perhaps in my own service, that our people will be looked after?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're determined to look after all the wonderful men and women of our armed services, not just by protecting them after they've served, protecting veterans who may be at risk of vexatious litigation in the way that I have described, but making sure that we look after them during their service, and particularly looking after families who often bear the brunt of the commitments, the sacrifices that our armed services face. And that's why one of the things that we've committed to, Mr. Speaker, is wraparound childcare for those involved in our armed services.
Let's go to Florence Session-Lomi. Florence. Sound. Can't hear her. We'll come back. Let's go to Right Honourable Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister putting diplomacy at the very heart of the integrated review, and with new resources going into the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Is it not the case that we have an independent Britain, but an independent Britain still needs to be very at the heart of multilateral democracy, multilateral institutions and multilateral diplomacy around the world, and that includes conflict prevention and conflict resolution?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend, and we are continuing to support all the sustainable development goals that he rightly mentions, and we believe passionately in diplomacy. The flag is going up around the world in embassies and legations and consulates around the world. The UK flag is actually going up, I'm proud to say, in Australasia, in Africa, around the world.
Let's go to Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart C.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why on earth slash budgets used to tackle corruption and promote good governance around the world? And why slash support for the research our universities do to help the poorest countries combat disease? Aren't these exactly the sort of soft power policies that deliver positive results and earn respect, rather than extortionate, grotesque and provocative nuclear weapons spending?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is the country that spends the most on the global vaccine alliance. This is the country that spends £548 million on COVAX, 1.6 billion on Gavi. We lead the world in health protection, in tackling conflict and poverty, in championing female education around the world. I really think international observers who come across Britons around the world working in these fields would simply not recognise the discussion and the debate they're hearing today in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. They know that this is a country that is massively committed to the welfare of the poorest and neediest in the world, and will remain so.
Let's go back to Florence Sessalome. Florence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents are concerned that much of this review seems to prioritise the global projection of hard power. The government have chosen to cut our aid budget to countries in need, like Syria and Yemen, and this will have serious knock-on effects. My constituent wrote to me and said Britain has a good track record in recognising the crucial role that aid plays in alleviating poverty and enhancing health equality. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this government's cuts to aid will not just let the world's poorest down, they will also make it more difficult for the government to achieve its foreign policy objectives and maintain Britain's global moral authority?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't remotely agree with that.
Let's go to Sir Roger Gale. Sir Roger.
Mr. Speaker, I share the view expressed by the Father of the House at the start of this discussion. I'm proud to be a member of a party that in its last manifesto commitment said it would spend 0.7% of gross national income in overseas aid. But because of the fall in GNI, we all know that the 0.7% represents less money than it did a year ago. And now isn't the time to cut our aid to the Yemen or to withdraw our support for voluntary services overseas. So would my right honourable friend consider bridging the gap by additionally donating extra supplies of the world's finest, safest COVID vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, to developing countries?
Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his suggestion. I just remind him of what I've said about the commitment of this country to overseas aid, which is enormous by any objective view. And on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, this is the only vaccine in the world under the terms of the deal struck between the UK government, the Oxford scientists and AstraZeneca that is sold at cost around the world. And I thank him for raising it, because I think it's another reason for people in this country to be proud of the outward-looking and engaged and fundamentally compassionate attitude of the British government and people.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dealing with authoritarian regimes around the world, especially those that don't want to play by the rules, is always complicated and difficult. I understand that, but we have to be consistent, coherent, determined, and brutally tough when we need to. What I don't understand in relation to Russia and in relation to China is why the government still refuses to declare what is happening in the Xinjiang province as genocide, and why it's used every power to try and prevent this bill, the Parliament, from coming to a determination on that. Why we still won't use the Magnitsky sanctions, which I applaud the Foreign Secretary for having introduced in the first place, but why we haven't used them against Carrie Lam for what's happening in Hong Kong. and why we still refuse to do enough about the dirty Russian money that is imperiling our financial transparency in the City of London and in our overseas territories.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the House has heard many times, it is up to the competent court to determine whether genocide has taken place. We've consistently called out what's happened in Xinjiang and what continues to happen. As for the use of Magnitsky sanctions, actually, of course, they have been used by this government against Russia for what they did. And by the way, at the time, the Labour front bench, and including the right honourable gentleman, were sitting like great squatting Buddhas, immobile, Mr. Speaker, whilst the then Labour leader was effectively endorsing the line from the Kremlin.
I think we do need to be careful on what allegations we're making. Right, let us go to Richard Drax on the final question. Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Global Britain remains the buzzword, and our armed forces have a key role to play with the integrated review. And with that in mind, and the many responsibilities my right honourable friend has committed to, can he reassure me that he will expand the army to 100,000, as our chief ally, the US, has recommended, rather than see it wither on the vine to 72,000 by cutting recruiting, thereby avoiding redundancies?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Army, including reserves, he will be pleased to know, will be over 100,000. But it is the duty of this government to take the tough decisions that are necessary to modernise our armed forces as well. And that's why we're investing £24 billion and undoing some of the mistakes, I'm afraid, that were made by the previous Labour government.
I'm now suspending the House for 2 minutes in order for the necessary arrangements to be made for the next business order.